Hey, you're out in the garage with TheEZGZ. I want to thank everybody that made comments and gave me thumbs up on that 10,000 subscriber video. Thanks a lot. It means a lot. And it keeps me turning on that camera. I really appreciate it. I've been mentioning lately that I'm kind of in the mood for a trip, and the Baja has been spotting quite a bit lately. I had no idea where it's coming from. Engine was filthy. I've been doing a lot of dirt roads and I've neglected it. I just haven't spent a lot of time on this engine, and I want to paint this pulley and, you know, clean it up a little bit because it is exposed. What else did I do? I had a valve cover that was leaking pretty bad on this side. So what I did is I took it to the car wash, cleaned it all up. A few weeks ago I checked the, I didn't know where the oil leak was really coming from, and replaced the valve cover gaskets. And just by the by, this is my 2-liter engine, and it has those low dollar aftermarket heads. They're like $160 a piece, and you do have to spend a little time if you want them to work well. The flash, you get what you pay for. The casting, flashing in between the fins needed to be cleaned up. You have to get in there with a file or a disc or something and clean that out so you got airflow through them. But I did not know what to expect from these. I was breaking studs on that other set of heads that I had, and had ratio rocker arms. I went back to stock rocker arms. I put these heads on it, and I took off cross country to Michigan, and I checked the valves in Michigan and they were fine. That was just, you'd think at least one time you'd have to check them, but I didn't even have to change anything. I checked them, but there was no change. And then recently, on the way back from Michigan, this has been a couple years ago, guys, I remember that it started hesitating a little bit, and I thought, well, I wasn't sure what the problem was. And then the car sat for a while. You go on those long trips and you get your fix for Volkswagens. It's like, all right, get this thing away from me. And it sat for a few months. Let me tell you, it was a few months. Then I started driving it again, and the jet, idle jet on number 2 was partially clogged. And I just randomly started pulling jets to figure out if jets were indeed the problem. The first one I pulled out, I saw that crap in there. I put it in. I didn't change the idle adjustment. I didn't change anything other than clean that jet out. And it just felt like renewed power. So it does affect your power. And the reason I'm telling you this is because that's the only valves I had to adjust. They probably got hot and the seats moved a little bit. And it was only by like a thousandths or so, but I get anal on my valve adjustments, and I don't do them as frequently as I used to, because I don't drive my street cars, as hard as I used to. Simple as that. But at any rate, new valve cover gaskets, check the valves, and it's still spotting. So I thought, well, it felt thick. It felt like it might be transmission. So let's go underneath, and I want to give you my version of checking your transmission oil, because I think some people do it wrong. First off, with the Baja on these large tires and having the adjusters up, it's a little easier to get underneath the car. But what I'm trying to say here is you want your car in the normal height that it would be sitting level in a flat parking lot, or in front of your house, or in your garage. So if you do have a stock car and need to lift it up, take some measurements before you start, and then make sure it's in the same vicinity once you get your jack stands underneath it. If you just jack up one side big enough to crawl underneath there, or take a wheel off and you have your car tilted, it's going to affect the oil level that you have in that transmission. And I think too many people overfill their transmissions. This transmission that's in here, when I bought this car, it had a freeway flyer and big tires on it, and first gear was so tall, it was crazy. It was just not acceptable. Before I went on that trip, I just wanted to get a plain old stock transmission. I was running, I built a close third and fourth tranny, which with these tires made it closer to stock within a few hundred RPM, and it started making noise, so I pulled that out. Fixed it, decided to try it in the tub buggy over there, and it's still in there. And the transmission that was in there, I don't know. You know how I have these transmission nightmares, and then I got this desert race car, and it's got different gears in it too. So I just wanted a plain stock transmission. So I traded a buddy of mine an engine block for a used unknown transmission, and then I took it, brought it home, and I filled it up. It was low on oil. I drained it out, put fresh oil in it, ran it for 100 miles, stuck my finger in there to look at the oil, and it was all orange and bubbly, and it looked like water had been in there, and it's like, oh my gosh. It shifted okay, it sounded okay, it stayed in gear. So I dumped that oil and I refilled it, and I've been running that oil. I've checked it a few times. The color looked good. The consistency looked good. It has always, on cold running, had a little bit of a crunch, you know, when you go to second, sometimes third. It's old. It's a used transmission. I've got these aftermarket half shafts on here with long splines, hoping to not break a CV joint if I go off-roading with it. And I can't even tell you why I put those on. Probably from past experience, because I was left stranded many miles from home with a broken CV joint. And every time something happens to you that's unpleasant, you try to avoid that situation again. And that goes with anything in life, right? So, I guess when I was in there messing around with I had a broken bearing when I got this car. The trailing arm on the driver's side was broke. Man, the frame horns were bent. We've done so much to this thing in the last 5 years. The engine was tilted cockeyed because somebody had been jumping it, and the frame horns were bent. The motor mounts were done. The bearing was broke on the left side. There was issues with the front end, ball joint. Oh my gosh, it just, you know, but it's, what I did was prioritize them. I did them one at a time, and we kept rolling, we kept moving. And that's what you need to do to your car. Volkswagen people are low budget people. They just don't have the money, the majority of them. You know, you're going to see those guys in the magazines, and you're going to see other guys on YouTube doing total overhauls, but I'm not that patient. I'm not going to do a body off restoration and then go beat the bejesus out of this thing out in the dirt. No, that's not how I roll, and I'm not satisfied with just a street vehicle. I like these Bajas because you can easily access that engine. You can run lots of different types of exhaust systems on it. You can keep the heater boxes or not. You can get a visual on it. Every time you walk up to it, you can see if you have a problem sooner. I always run these extra sumps, these oil sumps on the bottom of my engine, and people say, oh, you know, why are you doing that on an off-road car? Well, I don't off-road that hard, and if you look at it with the alignment on the engine, I haven't rubbed it or scraped it yet for the type of driving that I do. If you run harder, you might want to put a bash plate underneath it, but eventually all Volkswagen engines are going to leak. You start going crazy angles, and you build hot rod motors that get hot. You don't put the thermostats and flaps in it. You look right in there. See that thermostat? It's closed. It's a cold engine. I run the fat straps in the thermostat because I get on the interstate highway and I might drive 800 miles in a day. Oh, that was killer. I did that twice. I can't believe it, in the same year. But it's usually on the way home, and you know, when you put 500 miles down and you've got 300 miles from home, you say to yourself, oh, you know, I already did 5, what's 3, and I can go a little further. And then the closer you get to home, you say, I don't want to spend the money on a hotel, and I want to sleep in my own bed. And you just keep pushing yourself, you know. So anyhow, enough of that BS. But when you run a larger engine and you run light and flywheels and you make more horsepower, your engine wraps quicker and your RPM goes up higher. It's easy to turn 5,500 in one of these hot rod engines. And with the stock oil system that was never designed for that, you'll get away with it for a long time. Some guys overfill their crankcases on their sand rails because of the odd angles and seeing the oil light coming on and stuff. But you got to remember, the oil light and your oil pressure gauge is just telling you pressure. It could be air pressure. It's not necessarily oil pressure. When you get an air bubble in there and it's surrounded by foam, it's going to keep going, and your oil pressure gauges are not that sensitive where they move around. And if you've got one of those mechanical gauges with that long nylon tube, it ain't sensitive either. You got on a Volkswagen, it's not like a modern V8 where you've got the firewall and the oil pressure 2 feet from the gauge. You got to run 7 feet of 1/8 inch plastic oil line or copper, whatever it is you're running, to get it up in the dash to look at that oil pressure gauge. You shut your car off and you've got oil pressure. You count to 10, you still got oil pressure, and you start to see it slowly moving down, because that is cooled and it's not getting exact measurement. You're not seeing what really is going through your bearings, is what I'm trying to tell you. Doesn't matter whether you have an electric one or you have a mechanical one. Pressure's pressure, and you'll get air through there, and you don't want that. It shortens the life of your motor, and it starts not making as much power, starts using a little bit of oil, starts puffing when you shift, one thing after another, and it doesn't happen right away. It's a gradual thing. So that's why it's important. I just run the 1.5 quart, which is the minimum. They have 4 quart thin line sumps. They got all kinds of configurations of stuff. But I've run these things, and my friends have run these things out in the sand. We have pounded them and left divots in the sand time after time after time. I've never had a bash plate underneath there, and I've never had one come loose, crack, break, leak, or do anything wrong. I used to run strictly the Gene Berg sumps, but they're all good now. They're all good now, and the casting processes are good, and it gives you that extra oil. Now, you got an extra 1.5 quart oil there, then you've got an external oil filter. So, okay, stock is like 2 3/4 quarts to the full mark on a stock 1600 engine. So you add a 1.5 quart sump, and you add one of these, all of a sudden, and the hose that comes up here, now you're looking at 4 and 5 quarts of oil. You don't have to run that much oil. You don't have to run it. And if you do fill it up clear to the top, it doesn't make any difference one way or the other. They have dry sump oil systems. I used to run a dry sump oil system in my last sand car because of all the odd angles and stuff we were going into. The less oil you have in there in the turbulence and sloshing around, your crankshaft is above your camshaft. So all that spill off from your connecting rods and stuff is dribbling down directly onto the camshaft. And it's not an issue. But you got to have oil going to your bearings, for God's sakes. You got to have that. So what I'm saying is I can look at my dipstick with this on it and be reading where it says to add a quart. I know I've got plenty of oil. So if I'm at a gas station or on a ride or someplace and I don't have the oil I normally run, and I'm not going into that, then I can wait till I get home and know I'm perfectly safe, and I can drive accordingly. I can run till I almost don't see any oil on the dipstick and have as much as a stock one, because the tube, you're not just adding extra oil underneath it, you're extending the pickup tube 3 inches. You're going to the bottom down there, so you're always picking up fresh, cool oil. And that's the other thing. You can see the way this thing is finned on the top and the bottom, and there's a little bit of a space that goes all the way through. So you get a little extra oil cooling when you run these sumps. I like them. I run them on my stroker motors. There's one over here on the 2110. Save me a few steps. I run it over there too. It doesn't catch on anything. It's not as low as the shock of the mounts on these IRS transmissions. So, just saying. Do what you want. It's not mandatory. It's just, in my opinion, you're just a little extra insurance. So, now, let's go underneath here. See if I can do this with... Okay, so I've used a 17 millimeter Allen wrench. You can use, if you don't have one of these big Allen wrenches, I like this one because it sits up above. You can put that plug in. I need to add some oil to this thing, but I'm just gonna show you how easy this is. You don't need to gob this thing with Teflon tape, and you don't need to put sealer and stuff on it, especially if you got like an off-road car like this. Okay, so you got it in there. This frame horn's kind of in the way. Then I take my 17 millimeter wrench and I reach up in here and I loosen it or tighten it. You've got oil. Put a little of that 90 weight oil on the threads. It's a tapered thread similar to a pipe plug, and just snug it up and go a little bit more. Some of these things, guys, drive them in there so tight, and you don't want Teflon tape getting inside there. You've got a vent tube in the front, and you're always going to see oil in the front if you off-road like this and go down these steep hills and ruts and ditches and things like I do. And this is down a little bit. I thought it would be down a lot further. So I'm going to add some oil. You don't want to put so much oil in there that, I don't know what you're seeing now or not. I'm trying to look in the viewfinder. You don't want to put so much oil in there that it's just pouring out, and then you hurry up and put in the plug. You're overfilling it basically. And it's just going to be resting on the seals. On an IRS tranny, you've got seals over on both axles where the CV joint bolts onto, the flange seal on both sides. Those can develop small leaks over a while, and you can have leaks. This whole thing's going to be dirty. I just got underneath here real good with when I was at the car wash a couple weeks ago, and got all that excess garbage off. And if you can do that, that really makes your life a lot better. Spend $2 or $3 and get this thing cleaned up. Now I've got oil that's been, I don't know if I'm doing this right, I've got oil that's been showing up over here. I sprayed all that off, so I think what's happening is the rear main seal on my engine is starting to weep a little bit more than I like. And of course, I don't put any type of sealer or Loctite or anything on this assembly, and it really makes a difference on what kind of nuts that you have on here. You try to use those cap nuts, and you try to use those little copper washers, but I'm just telling you, all of mine always leak a little bit. You know, I just wiped it off with a paper towel so I wouldn't get it on my shirt while I was crawling around here with the camera, but they're always going to leak. Another thing I'm going to do today is I want to pull the plugs, because this engine's always had awesome oil pressure, and with that extra oil pressure you're encouraging leaks as well. But this is an aluminum engine block. This engine's probably, you know, I like this aluminum. It is heavier, but I like it on these stroker motors. All your Type 4 engines that Volkswagen came out for those later buses were aluminum, and I never hear about people line boring those cases, and it's just, it was harder for them to machine, you know, mass produce. It cost a little more, it was heavier, a little bit more machining involved. Some people complain that these aluminum cases, the oil galleys and things, you have to be careful when you assemble it. Make sure that the oil holes line up with the bearings, and you know, you have to take a little extra care because it is, you know, aftermarket stuff. But my pushrod tubes, these are just stock steel ones, and they're not rusting. I run the tin, but I also run Type 3 tin, and I have that wired up so that it's tight, not rubbing on the pushrod tubes. And that's why I don't have that other little piece of trim up here. And I'm running the heater boxes, but you know, this setup, this is what they call the cool tin, and it does go on the bottom. You have to take your head off and redo the seals on this pushrod. You cannot just add this piece later. You have to do it during assembly. Instead of using the little divider plate, you put this whole plate and it covers both cylinders and crosses over, and it does an excellent job of cooling. I'm using a cast iron plate on the back of my oil pump. I'm using a 6-pound pulley on my, I'm using a Lighten flywheel, but I put the weight back on in the back here. That distributes it over the length of the crankshaft. It helps with harmonics. It's supposed to extend the life of your bearings and so on and so forth. Rusty exhaust, that's just what you're going to get. Even that ceramic coating after a while will start coming off. But you know, these things are really old, and I probably bought them at the swap meet to begin with. So you know, I think this particular setup, it could be 20 years old. I don't think it's the one that came on here. But they got small flanges and they all kind of leak after a while, and you know, it is what it is. It depends on what you want, what you're willing to tolerate and live with, and what your compromises are. But for oil hose, I'm using this push lock. I think it's a power steering hose, and this still has a bit of softness to it, and this thing is very old. I recently oiled these, added these hose clamps. I wasn't even running hose clamps on it, but I had so much oil back here I wasn't sure where it was coming from, and I just kind of took it to the car wash, sprayed it all down, added those hose clamps, run it for a couple of weeks. Now I'm checking the oil in the tranny, and it looks like if I go on a really long trip, I probably should pull that motor and change that flywheel seal. So I'm gonna add some of this magic. I like it. Oh, I really like Lucas products, and this is a pure synthetic. It's almost like, some of you young guys won't remember STP oil treatment, but it's like a 600 weight oil. I mean, this stuff is gooey. It's sticky. The bottle's almost empty, so I don't know how to really demonstrate this. Whoop. It's real clear, but look at the tack on that. This stuff is real sticky, but it's very slippery. This should be on the nightstand. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But this stuff is real slick, and I'm going to put it in there, and maybe it will improve a little bit of my synchronizers, my shifting. It can't hurt anything. I should probably just do a complete oil swap, but I'm not in the mood, and the oil that was in there looked really good. And it is just a little bit low. I've just run my finger down there and pull my finger out and look where it is on my finger, and it's just, you know, it's up past my nail, even when I got my first up to my first joint going over that little hole in the transmission. So yeah, so anyhow, that's what I'm doing this morning. Thanks again. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subbing. TheEZGZ out.